Hi, and welcome back to our next module on this unit about logic. So last module we focused on fallacies. So these are mistakes in our reasoning behind an argument or in our strategy with how we put an argument together that really makes it either an invalid or poorly formed argument. Now that we've kind of seen what not to do in the different categories and types of fallacies, we're going to start looking at, well, what does a good argument or a valid argument look like? This is what we call syllogisms, and they're going to be kind of the basic skill set that we need to develop in order to then grow our ability to make good arguments, use good reasoning, make solid points. And you're going to see that this skill set is actually pretty fundamental beyond philosophy, whether it's making a good point in a paper, an argument in a post, dialogue or conversation with another individual, debates. Being able to master this skill set of syllogisms is going to be your best friend. So let's hop right into it. Syllogism, as I just mentioned, is basically the simplest form of an argument within logic. It comes from the Greek word syllogismos, which means conclusion, to reach a conclusion. And that's essentially what every syllogism does, is you're reaching a conclusion, but you're getting there by evidence and by connecting evidence together, comparing different premises, pieces of evidence in order to reach that conclusion. So in that regard, a syllogism is made up of three propositions. A proposition is a sentence that makes a claim. And so it is made up of two separate premises and then one conclusion. So two premises, one conclusion. These make up three propositions as a basic syllogism. So here is a very basic example, oftentimes used in beginner's philosophy to depict a syllogism. So you see here two premises and a conclusion. So I'll read the whole syllogism, then I'll break it down. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So the syllogism would have two premises. So the first premise is all men are mortal. Then it'll make a second separate premise, Socrates is a man, and then it'll draw a conclusion from those two premises together by comparing them to form the conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. So as we're going to see later on, when you try to create your own syllogism, think of working from the back to the front. So what is the conclusion and what premises can I write to support it? Well, let's break this down a little bit more to see how this actually works. So in every syllogism, apart from the two premises and the one conclusion, there are different components to each syllogism. It's about having the correct components and comparing them in the right way that you reach a valid conclusion and therefore a valid syllogism. So, and we'll show this on the same example in a second. So every syllogism has basically five parts. There's really three main parts that you really need to know in order to write a good syllogism. And those first three parts are the minor term, the major term, and the middle term. So the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So in a sentence, the predicate is everything after the subject, usually including the verb. And the middle term is the phrase or word that appears in each premise, so those two earlier statements, but it's not in the conclusion. It's essentially what connects the two premises together. It's going to be really important. We're going to discuss it a little bit more in a second. As a result, the two premises can be thought of as the major premise and the minor premise. And basically what that means is whatever premise has the major term in it is called the major premise. Whatever premise has the minor term in it is the minor premise. So the major term and the minor term will never be together except in the conclusion. So each term, so to speak, will have its own premise. It'll be made up of the minor term and the middle term. The next one will be the major term and the middle term, and then the final conclusion will be the minor and middle term without, the minor and the major term without the middle term. And basically what this is building on is what we call the law of syllogism, or in other words, reasoning by transitivity, which essentially points to the transitive property of equality between ideas and items. In other words, that reason can build upon itself. and there's a transitive property of equality between minor term and major term to reach a conclusion. So the classic way of writing this out, even it sounds a little mathematic, but remember when we talked about in Socrates, mathematics was, according to Socrates, founded as an offshoot of philosophy, trying to understand the known world. So here we go. We got our letters in play. But this is a basic way of understanding the law of syllogism. That if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So it's showing the property of equality between A and C by comparing it to this middle term, B. So if you note, B is not in the final conclusion. The final conclusion is A equals C. And so in this way, you think about it in terms of the minor, major, and middle term. The major term, the minor term is the A, the major term is the B, and the middle term is the C. So if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. Another way of understanding this that Kreeft goes into in his book is what he calls S, P, and M. He uses these as the abbreviations for the minor term, major term, and middle term. We're going to use it in this presentation as well. So the minor term is going to be referred to as S, major term is P, and middle term is M. So you could also think of it in this way, as if S equals M and P equals M, then S equals P. That's also another way to look at it. So again, the long story short is we are making connections between the two premises, the minor term and the major term in the two premises, in order to reach a conclusion. Why go about it this way? Because it's a way of creating evidence to support your claim. Rather than just stating the conclusion, you're making a case for your conclusion. And that is using good reasoning and good logic. When you can support an argument with valid logic and evidence, you're making a good claim. And we want to be able to do that, not just to write good papers, but to just be competent in our conversation and in our dialogue as human beings, to be able to support the conclusions that we're making and ensure the conclusions we're making in conversation are actually valid. And in this way, in Socratic fashion, we are building on each other to reach ultimate truth, to move out of the cave, so to speak, in the search for wisdom. So let's go back to that first syllogism that we looked at. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Whenever we look at examples in this presentation, I'm always going to use the same colors. So the middle term is going to be in yellow, the major term is in red, and the minor term is in green. In this case, the major premise is first, the minor premise is second, the conclusion is always going to come last. But in this case, the major premise precedes the minor premise. Also, I have here in this particular instance, the middle term comes before the major term and the minor term before the middle term. It doesn't always need to be the case when you're writing your own syllogism. The major term could come before the middle term could come before the minor term. But just be mindful of your wording so that it's clear and that it makes sense in the way you're writing your premises. So that's why I kind of give this framework to begin with. Just follow it. Could be easier for you to just follow at the beginning. What always holds true in the conclusion is that the minor term comes before the major term and there's no middle term. Why? Because the minor term is the subject of the conclusion, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion, ergo the verb and what comes after it. So when you're trying to then write and evaluate a syllogism, remember, start with your conclusion and work backwards. So when you're trying to figure out what's your major term and your minor term, let's look at the conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Well, Socrates is the subject of that sentence. So we know that the word Socrates is the minor term. And so it begins here, rightfully so, the minor premise. Mortal is the part of the predicate. And so it's the major term. And we see it here correctly in the major premise. Notice that the middle term, men, is in both the major premise and minor premise, but not in the conclusion. And so really what we're doing is we're building up an argument. Rather than just saying Socrates is mortal, we're trying to argue, well, how do we know Socrates is mortal? And the key to this is the middle term. That's why when you go to create your own syllogism, having a good middle term is going to be so key because it's going to make the deductive reasoning work. So deductive reasoning is deducing a conclusion. So what we're doing is we're making a connection between the major term and the minor term through the use of the middle term in each to be able to deduce why our conclusion is logical, rather than just saying the conclusion, showing why it is logical. So it's a really simple syllogism, but let's go through it. So all men are mortal. So it makes sense. It is a true statement to say that all humans will die, that we're not immortal. Okay, that's a good premise, makes sense. Next premise, Socrates is a man. Well, it's true. We knew that Socrates was a human. All Socratic problem aside, Socrates was put forward as a man. Therefore, and this is that great that great intro word that basically tells you that this is deductive reasoning. As a result of these two premises that we have stated, therefore, it is logical to believe that Socrates is mortal, that he will die one day, because this middle term is true for both mortal and Socrates. That if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, it stands to reason, it follows that Socrates is mortal. We're going to use that phrase, it follows, throughout the presentation. To say that something follows is to mean that it's logical. To say that it doesn't follow, say that it's illogical, it doesn't make sense. So if we were to apply the A, B, and C, or MSP, to this equation, you would see the yellow as B, mortal in this case, because it comes first, would be C. Socrates would be A. So because B equals C and A equals B, then A equals C. Or if we were to use the MPS, because M equals P and S equals M, then S equals P. That's essentially what you're doing when you're creating that syllogism. So remember that order. Middle term and major term together form the major premise. Minor term and middle term together form the minor premise. Middle term is not in the conclusion. The subject of the conclusion is the minor term. The predicate of the conclusion is the major term. The conclusion is ultimately what you're trying to prove. That's the whole purpose of a syllogism, is attempting to show why the conclusion not only is logical, but are giving evidence for why it is logical. And that's the purpose of the premises. A lot of times when conversation, we just make statements and conclusions and hold them to be true without kind of showing why someone should believe that they are true. That's the role of the premises. When we're able to give two and even more, sometimes syllogisms are longer, two or more premises that build on one another, have the same middle term to show how they're connected, A equals B, B equals C, so A equals C. Then we're actually able to now not just make a statement, we're actually able to argue why it's true and use good logic. That's the whole premise of logic, is the way we make arguments, the way that we support our claims. It's so crucial. When you go to write paragraphs in your paper, essentially what you're doing is putting several premises together, showing how they build on each other to reach a conclusion. Think back to some of the examples on, well, how did Socrates depict the search for wisdom? Well, because Socrates had the philosophical eros, and because Socrates questioned individuals with the Socratic method, because he used Socratic dialogues, it can be shown, because he used Socratic dialogues to seek for wisdom, it can be shown that Socrates sought for wisdom. That's a very on-the-spot moment example, but if we were to flesh out those different premises, that would be an example of how you could write a paper or a paragraph by proving each of those premises and connecting them together to prove your ultimate conclusion, which would be your thesis statement. So that's kind of a very broad way of explaining how you're probably already trying to use syllogisms in your writing, but getting good at them, that's going to be the difference between your arguments being well supported and logical and them not making sense. So remember, let's get good at this skill set. So ultimately, the syllogism is you're trying to prove a conclusion. The premises before that conclusion are the evidence for that to argue for that conclusion to be true. The middle term is what connects the two premises together, since it's what's shared between them. And so if you don't have a good middle term, the syllogism either holds as logical or falls apart. So think of the middle term as doing the work, showing why the premises prove the conclusion to be true. So let's go through a different example. Okay, remember, we're going to keep this main prototype of a syllogism up here, so you can understand the different parts of the example before us. So let's read it through first. So all dogs are animals. German shepherds are dogs. Therefore, German shepherds are animals. So remember here, if B equals C and A equals B, then A equals C. So it stands to reason that all dogs are animals. It is true that every dog, regardless of what species or not species, what kind of dog it is, they're all animals. We know that to be biologically true. German shepherds we know to be a kind of dog, so that is also true. It is reasonable. So both premises here are true. The middle term here, dogs, connects them together. So we know if German shepherds are dogs and all dogs are animals, it stands to reason that, therefore, German shepherds are animals. But I want you to really see how if you kind of put your fingers over the word dogs on the screen, that's what the difference between just making like a does statement and actually making an argument that builds on itself, that deduces. So you want to make sure you have a good middle term that makes the connection between why German shepherds, it's reasonable to understand that German shepherds are animals. Now I know this example sounds like very obvious, but it's to underscore the point that you can't assume that the conclusion is valid and logical. You kind of have to argue for it by making two statements that connect to one another. So in the work of syllogisms, we have to be mindful of a couple of laws. The major law is the law of non-contradiction. It's pretty much a basic law of logic, and it basically is showing that no proposition, so a proposition is any one of those three statements, the major premise, the minor premise, or the conclusion. It's basically showing that no proposition can be true and false at the same time. It either has to be true or it has to not be true. It can't be both true and false. There's no middle ground in syllogisms. Why? Because you're trying to create a conclusion. You're trying to argue for a point. You can't do that with ambiguity. So there either is or is not a contradiction between two premises in order to confirm a conclusion. So that means, and we'll talk about that in a second, that you can't have a positive premise and a negative premise, but you can't have ambiguous premises, or you can't have two negative premises. So each proposition has to either be completely true or completely false. It can't be both. So Aristotle talked about this when he spoke of logic, and his formulation of this law is as follows. He gives the example of the same property cannot belong and not belong to the same subject at the same time in the same respect. So I can't own my house and not be the owner of my house at the same time. It either is true or it's not. So the example here of P, of the major premise, so if the major premise is true, then the major premise is not false. Kind of sounds redundant, but we have to make sure that we're clear about that, because when we're writing syllogisms, depending how in depth we get or what we're writing about, they can become pretty confusing. We're using pretty basic examples just to get the point across of the syllogism here. But I say this, and these laws exist just as you're writing syllogisms and deducing arguments in your own life and in your own writing and in your own work. Just remember that propositions, the premises and conclusions you put forward, they have to either be true or false. There's no kind of in between. There's no well, it's just a matter of opinion, at least in the way that you write them. They have to be either true statements or false statements. So this law leads to two subsequent laws. There's a law of identity, which is basically pretty simply that each premise is what it is. So if P is true, P is true. This basically comes from the understanding of the law of non-contradiction, that a proposition can be true. It either has to be true or it has to be false. It can't be both at the same time. So if you're going to say that P is true, then its identity is true. It can't be anything else other than true. It can't be ambiguous. Whatever it is, it is. It's pretty much that simple. And there's also the law of excluded middle, which goes back just to the other premise of the law of non-contradiction that I referred to, which is it can't be both at the same time. There's no middle. It either is the minor premise or it's not. Or either it's the minor premise, either S is P or not P. So either the minor premise equivocates to the major premise or it doesn't. There's no kind of middle ground that it could, that it might, or that it might not. It either it is or it's not. And so just remember that as you're writing your syllogisms, that each premise can't be ambiguous. Each premise either has to be positive or negative. They both can't be negative. They are what they are, and there's no middle ground because you're trying to reach a definitive conclusion in your argument. To be ambiguous, essentially to be illogical, or at the very least to have a weakly put together argument. So we've alluded to this idea of a negative premise. So let's talk about what this actually is. So a negative premise is essentially a premise written in a negative form. So for example, on the screen we see the phrases, no men are insects, or no insects write logic books, as opposed to a positive premise like the one we just saw, all dogs are animals, or here on the screen, all men are mortals. It's written in the positive form. The basic rule is this: you can't write a valid conclusion that follows, or a logical, true conclusion that follows, with two negative premises. If you're going to have a negative premise, at least one of them needs to be positive. Because when you put two negative premises together, it usually results, or always results, in an illogical conclusion that doesn't follow. So let's look at the two examples on the screen. The first one, no men are insects. No insects write logic books, therefore no men write logic books. So in the first premise, no men are insects, the minor premise and the middle term don't agree. No men are insects. It makes sense that men aren't bugs. The second premise, no insects write logic books. So the middle term and the major term don't agree. In this case, again, that premise on its own seems to make sense. It makes sense to say that insects don't write logic books. No insects write logic books. But then notice the conclusion. Therefore, no men write logic books. It doesn't follow. We're using right now for this module a logic book written by a human, written by a man. So to say that no men write logic books is illogical. And well, you say, well, how's that true if both premises on their own seem like they're true? Well, it's because they're both written in the negative form as negative premises, and so it results in a conclusion that doesn't follow. Let's look at the example below of a valid syllogism that has a negative premise. So the first premise, no mortals are gods, are written in the negative. The second premise, all men are mortals, is written in the positive. As a result, the conclusion, therefore no men are gods, follows. It makes sense because it's true that no mortals are gods, so those who can die are not immortal, and all humans are truly mortals, we can die. So to say that no men are gods, no men are immortal, is true. So again, simply remember, you can't have two negative premises, you have to have at least one positive premise. The general rule of thumb, it's always easier to write in terms of positives and usually makes for a stronger syllogism, but you can use a negative premise, just make sure there's a positive premise to go with it. Let's talk a second about what we call demonstrative syllogisms. So while syllogisms might be valid. In other words, we follow the rules of non-contradiction, we follow the rule of making sure there's not two negative premises, and we can write a syllogism that follows the rule. Not all valid syllogisms are true demonstrative syllogisms. So in other words, to say a syllogism is demonstrative is that the premises in it can be proven to be true. A valid syllogism requires that the conclusion be drawn logically from the premises. In other words, that the conclusion can be supported by the evidence logically. They have to share a middle term that has at least one positive premise, as we just went over. The conclusion must be a necessary conclusion from the two premises, and it cannot be universalized from particular premises. In other words, remember the fallacy of you can't argue from the part to the whole? That means a strong syllogism, or an example of a not strong syllogism or a weak syllogism, would be to say something like Socrates was smart, and Socrates is a man, therefore all men are smart. In this case, you're using Socrates as the middle term, and while it's true to say that Socrates is smart and Socrates is a man, because you're trying to argue from a particular premise to a larger premise, and this is a syllogism, it's not true that all men are smart. That wouldn't be a logical conclusion based on what we know of reality. And so this is because you're trying to argue from a particular premise, the particular situation of Socrates, and are trying to apply it to a universal truth of all men, you can't do that. It's a general principle. And so when you break that principle, you try to use a small thing to represent a universal, bigger thing. It's not going to lead to a strong syllogism that is what we call a demonstrative syllogism. A true demonstrative syllogism requires that both premises are known to be true and can be demonstrated to be true. So in other words, you can't say dinosaurs believe in things because they have a mind. I believe in dinosaurs, therefore dinosaurs believe in me. Well, dinosaurs are dead. They don't exist anymore, and there's no way we can ever know that they believed fully in humans, and certainly can't say that dinosaurs believe in you when you live now and dinosaurs lived a very long time ago. So you can't demonstrate both of those premises of dinosaurs believe in things and I believe in dinosaurs. Well, you can show that I believe in dinosaurs, but you can't know for true that dinosaurs believe in things, and certainly as a result can't draw the conclusions that dinosaurs believe in you. So this is a bad, invalid, illogical syllogism. So both premises need to be known to be true and can be demonstrated to be true. And that the middle term is clear that in showing the cause of the conclusion. In other words, the middle term really tells us the real reason for the conclusion. So again, an example of not a strong syllogism based on the middle term is Hitler was hated by everyone. Hated people are not great people. Hitler was not a great person. The syllogism is valid. However, it's not a demonstrative syllogism. Why? Well, let's look at the middle term. The middle term here is hated people or individuals hated by all. And you have the minor term Hitler and the major term not great people. Well, we know that it's a valid conclusion that Hitler was not a great person. It is true to say that Hitler was hated by everyone, and most often than not, hated people are not great people. But Hitler was not a great person because he was hated. He was not a great person because he was a tyrant. Because a lot of what he did was immoral. And so saying that Hitler was a tyrant and tyrant are not great people, and therefore Hitler's not a great person, is a stronger syllogism because the middle term is more accurate in depicting the cause of the conclusion. In other words, popularity doesn't equal whether or not you're a great person. Well, you can deduce that hated figures in history like Hitler was not a great person. It's not that strong of a piece of evidence as to say, well, tyrants Hitler was not a great person because he was a tyrant, and that use of the middle term of tyrant as opposed to a hated by everyone is truer to why Hitler was not a great person. So this is getting into kind of more of the nitty gritty, but it goes to show that if you're trying to build not just a valid syllogism, but a true demonstrative syllogism, one that is really strong in its logic, you need to make sure that not only do you follow the rules of having a middle term and at least one positive premise, but also making sure that you're not trying to make a universal statement from a particular premise, and also making sure that the conclusion that you reach is really clear by a good middle term. So here's an example of a demonstrative syllogism. So whatever is composed of parts is destructible. Whatever is material is composed of parts. Therefore, whatever is material is destructible. This is a particularly good syllogism because of the middle term. So we know that things that are physical material things are made up of many parts. So a book is made up of paper and glue, string, ink. It's true, it's something that we can demonstrate. Whatever is composed of parts is destructible. We can also um, prove that to be true. That if something like a Lego set that can be destroyed, it's harder to destroy one single block of wood than maybe a stack of blocks like Jenga, for instance. So something that even a block of wood is made up of different more minute things, but that's an argument for a different point. You get what I'm trying to say. So both premises can be demonstrated, proven true, and the real reason why material things are destructible or more easily destructible is because they're composed of parts. So not only is it a valid syllogism, and both premises here are in the positive, and you're not trying to reach a universal conclusion from a very specific premise. They all pretty much are equivocable. And really the main reason, the direct cause for why something material being destructible is because it has a lot of parts. This is not only a strong syllogism, but it's a true syllogism. So this would be an example of a demonstrative syllogism. So at this point, we're going to ask you to make sure you do the reading, and then you're going to do a quiz on a couple of these terms and parts to make sure we understand the different parts of a syllogism. And then you're going to go into the last part of the module, which is going to ask you to practice writing your own syllogism.